we're doing a lot of work in SmartSense on understanding the language of the different equipment that keeps things hot or cold. And depending upon its language or its change of language, we'll actually tell the user, here's specifically what's going on that's wrong, and here's the corrective action that you need to do. And in many cases, back to your earlier comment, we're integrating that data now into other systems that do work order management. Well, we'll open a trouble ticket in an asset management system, and only us have the authority to close that ticket when that asset has been restored to its healthy state.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, the CEO of IoT One, and our guest today is Ron Konezny, CEO of Digi. Digi is a leading provider of business-critical IoT connectivity products and services that creates, deploys, and manages communication infrastructure in demanding environments. In this talk, we discuss the drivers behind Digi's ongoing transition from a product-centric company to a provider of solutions that integrates hardware, software, connectivity, and services. We also touched on emerging technologies that are increasingly important in Digi's tech stack, including LoRaWAN, 5G, and AI, as well as the evolution of IoT value creation from awareness of system status to remote control of systems and predictive analysis of outcomes. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, you can email us at team@iot1.com. Finally, if you have a research strategy or innovation initiative that you'd like to discuss, please email me directly at erik.walenza@iot1.com. Thank you. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Hey, Eric, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a long time, actually. When we first set up IoT One back in 2015, you were one of the first companies on the radar. And probably, I don't know exactly what you are in our database, but I'm sure it's one of the first companies in our database. And so it's great to now have you on the podcast. Just to help orient people around where you're coming from personally, can you give kind of your 60-second backstory? And I know you joined Digi already about 10 years, but you have quite an interesting career before that as well.
Yeah, just briefly, Eric, I was born 7 pounds, 5 ounces. No, I'm kidding, of course. But out of college, I went into consulting and fell in love with wireless communications. And back then we were using wireless for voice, but I had this, not unique epiphany that we'd be using wireless for data much more than voice. And then the pendulum swung for me, Eric, from advising, suggesting, consulting to starting a company called PeopleNet, where we did fleet management for North American truckers. We had onboard computers that were installed in vehicles. It kept track of the driver's fuel economy, connected them with dispatch. Of course, you had GPS and eventually electronic logs and some other safety features like cameras. We ended up selling that business to Trimble Navigation. I stayed there for 3 years and then joined Digi. And before joining Digi, I had a chance to meet with the board of directors. And basically what I said was, if you hire me, we're going to go on a journey, and it's not going to be a straight line, but we're going to go on this journey from transforming a company that's been providing reliable hardware for decades to becoming a solution provider. And it's going to be tough. There's going to be challenges. There's massive cultural issues, economic issues, business model issues, and market issues. And, 9 years later, 25% of our revenue is recurring in nature. And that's the ultimate yardstick of us providing more value to the customer and, of course, benefiting Digi. And I like to joke with people, Eric, that I'm addicted to hardware-enabled recurring revenue models. And I'm not on medication and I'm not in therapy.
So hardware-enabled recurring revenue, which means then software. How much do services fit into that equation? Because services could be recurring, but also they have a different cost structure to deliver than software, certainly.
Yeah. And, IoT has been on this, decade plus long journey, preceded probably both of our tenures. But in the early days, you had hardware, and that hardware was very important. It connected to a machine, and it oftentimes relied on a wired connection to have the data that it was acquiring from a machine, an elevator, a generator, a manufacturing line. And that wired connection was the primary means. And then over time, wireless became a real viable option to transmit that data And then with wireless, there's of course local wireless standards like Wi-Fi and of course now LoRa, but then there increasingly cellular has been a big part. And then you transmit that data to ultimately either a cloud-based instance or you keep it on-prem if people are concerned about security. And then there's the storage and the analysts and analytics around the data of what does this mean and how do I then prompt users with good information to either take action or drive insights that drive longer-term change. And if you think about that stack, we've been building one block at a time. And there's been providers of hardware like Digi and now and even legacy, and there's providers of connectivity, of course, unlicensed and licensed spectrum, and there's providers of cloud and storage, there's providers of analytics and APIs for integration. And we've made it hard for users because they have to put all those blocks together to make that entire system sing. And they've got to do it not just once in many cases, but hundreds or thousands of times, and sometimes across the world. That's a very difficult problem to solve. And if you think about all those layers that create an IoT system and all the pieces, and then you say to yourself, well, how do I not just get something installed, but how do I maintain it and make sure that both the equipment you're monitoring, of course, is up and running, but the system that you're using to monitor itself is incredibly reliable and effective. That's where I think software, service, and subscription really plays. And of course, people kind of look at each other and laugh. And I'm dead serious because most companies don't have one. It's, Fred in engineering, it's Sally in IT, potentially a programmer, product manager, but it's a part-time role at best, right? And so I think as you're seeing the market mature and see value, they're looking for companies that, hey, this is what you do, and this is all you think about, and you've been doing for decades. You probably know a few things and are probably more efficient than we could do on our own.
Yeah, our company's name is IoT One, and often people think of IoT and they think about a very narrow sliver of the tech stack, right? And so, I end up spending a lot of time talking to people about systems and about how the way that we look at it, IoT is, it's a little bit similar to talking about the internet, right? I mean, the internet, there are a few technologies, HTML or whatever that you could say are really core to the internet, but really, the beauty of the internet is that it's this fantastically complex system that allows you to connect all sorts of different functionality into something that is to some extent holistic, right? And IoT, you can have a fairly narrow IoT use case that just, send data from here to here and then make a red light, flash. But if you're really creating a lot of value, often you're creating fairly sophisticated systems of, different technologies. And it doesn't really, in the end for us, it doesn't really matter to what extent the connectivity is the critical part versus the analytics. The point is, can you create a system that solves a problem? One question that I have around the services aspect, I was talking with a friend yesterday who's setting up a system integration business focused on logistics. And he was discussing how their primary focus is on selling hardware and software. That's where they expect to make revenue, but they're planning to also have a service part, not because they expect that to be profitable, break even would be fine, but because that's where they can have the deepest conversations with customers. And I'm curious, as you think about your business, where are the touch points where you find that you're able to have the deepest conversations and really understand, customer challenges today and also maybe customer goals, looking into the future? What are those touch points in the business?
It's a really good question, Eric. And one of the ways I lead into the conversations are, there used to be a time where you could deploy something and sort of set it and forget it. Right? Those days are gone. Regulatory changes, technology changes, security issues, your business opportunities and challenges. The pace of change is accelerating, and there's really nothing we can do about that. And so you've got to actively manage your IoT solution. You can't set it and forget it. A great example, just to bring it to life, we do quite a bit of work in medical devices. We service companies that provide infusion pumps, dialysis machines, surgical and operating beds. The FDA last year required any provider of medical devices to not only notify their customers of a critical vulnerability, should it arise, but have a resolution in place in a reasonable time. Now, you and I can argue about what reasonable is. This is something that medical device providers are like short-circuiting. I'm selling an infusion pump to a hospital. That hospital's IT person is actually managing that device. With all these cybersecurity threats, I can't just put an infusion pump out there anymore. I've got to actively manage that thing, because what if someone was able to gain access to that pump and had an impact on somebody's life? I mean, I would be inconsolable that I didn't take an action. And so we're now engaging with a number of our customers on security threat, visibility, managing, detecting, and responding because they don't have that capability in place right now. And it's a great example of a service we can provide to help make sure that their endpoint is secure. And we are monitoring these threats. It's part of our DNA. So it's not like we just started doing this. We have to design our products to be secure. And that's just one really highlighted example of where we can provide a service. And many times, Eric, our customers are wanting to enter into a contract. I was at CES recently, and we met with a large medical device provider. And as a background, when I first joined Digi, I went to our top 20 customers and said, hey, listen, what happens if I can't deliver you high quality products on a timely basis? And to a T, they all said that would be horrible. We'd be lying down. Our business would be impaired. I'm like, hey, I think it's in your best interest, not mine exclusively, to enter a managed service agreement. And this way you can hold me accountable to SLAs and even have me penalized if I don't hit those. And I make sure I deliver quality, timely. I was 1 for 20. These are big names. I was 1 for 20 because the supply chain was viewed as infinitely perfect and elastic, and we'd had great delivery success and high quality. So why would we need that? Fast forward, I literally almost cried. We're at this CS event. We're meeting in a room and we're talking about our solutions, how we can help them. And the customer said to me, okay, so what's my subscription? That's something I had never heard before proactively from a customer saying, I know I need to manage this long term. And especially medical devices, Erica, where the installations aren't a year or two. These are 10, 15-year type of installations. These medical devices, they don't go through hyper product development cycles. So they need to make sure these things are secure, not just for a year or two, but for a decade.
When people first started selling services around IoT, there would be even issues with just, accounting or procurement of that. We don't know how to draw up a contract. We don't have experience with that. So there's just some organizational friction to overcome that maybe takes some time. But what are the big factors that you think are making that conversation much easier today?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, security is one angle, and medical devices, it's probably, higher on the list than in some areas, even though it's on everybody's radar. Another great example is people wanting to have a sense of security around technology evolution. So, we've all been through the 3G to 4G. Now it's 4G to 5G. And so customers want assurances. Hey, what if 4G goes away? I just bought a bunch of 4G stuff. I need some protection. And as you enter 5G, generally things need to be domesticated before they become affordable. So in some cases, Eric, we're telling the customer, listen, you just rent the solution. Don't own it. The warranty is on us. If 4G is ever a threat, it's up to us to make sure you have a continuity of service and you're not stuck with bricks that don't work anymore. So technology is another angle. There's security, there's technology. There's also regulatory challenges that come about. And sometimes those regulatory challenges are spectrum-based, where spectrum has been reallocated or there's interference that comes up. Sometimes it's things like what I mentioned with the medical device company where the FDA got involved. It also can be other areas. You are no longer allowed to use equipment that is sourced from China. These are real threats that can impact a business's solution that is installed remotely, Eric. This isn't something you've got people to run out and just quickly swap out things. So you need to have some confidence that these things can have the resilience to last through these areas. And I think that's what customers are continuing to press us for, that risk abatement. And especially in today's world, Erica, I'm seeing many more customers ask for that risk off, whether that be warranty, whether it be patent and IPs, whether it be regulatory or security. And I think companies like Digi are in a good position to help those customers through those risk challenges because we're already doing it.
Yeah. This last topic, I'm curious, just because I'm sitting here in Shanghai today, is this something where you've seen that Digi has had to make big changes in your supply chain due to trade import regulations?
We've had to, the tariffs that were placed in the prior administration persist today. So we manufactured a lot more of our product in China prior to those tariffs. A lot of components are still sourced in China, but you're having to now produce those products in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Thailand, sometimes in Mexico, that don't have tariffs for the components. And then the finished goods can be shipped into countries like the United States and Canada without having that tariff. So we've decreased our manufacturing footprint in China, even though many of our components are sourced from Chinese suppliers, but they're sourced in areas that don't have the tariff boundaries. Another big thing, Eric, that's coming up is the FCC is increasingly paying more and more attention to wireless communications and to companies like Quectel, Fibocom, others that provide cellular radios. Are they embedding some kind of backdoor in there? Personally, I think those concerns are invalid. However, there are some customers, government entities in particular, that are told you can't procure things that have Chinese sourcing on particular components.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a challenging discussion, right? Because it gets very technical, and then in the end, you have people in Congress that are making decisions. And
it ends up being, you've heard of the TikTok balance, challenges. I mean, some of the stuff is very emotional, and some of it, quite frankly, is a legitimate concern. But I think most of it is.
There's this risk profile that is changing, and that motivates people to want to have support in the long term. I guess there's also on the value creation side, as you start to get analytics more deeply embedded in solutions, right? If it's kind of when X happens, flip a switch, put a light on, that's a pretty static solution. Once you start saying, okay, we're going to get a bunch of data and then we're going to analyze that and somehow convert that into value, all of a sudden you can get a lot more creative in terms of how you're using the systems. There's going to be a lot more people in the organization saying, hey, we're collecting this data. Could we be using this in a different way? How do you see conversations on the value creation side shifting as you move more into solutions?
Yeah, Eric, it's a very good point. So I think, again, the evolution of IoT is some of us our job was to get you the data, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, and then you take it from there. More customers now, Eric, are saying, okay, help me understand what this data means. Help me understand when I really need to take action, or this is really, flak or shrapnel. This isn't an actionable item. The main goal is uptime. If you're remotely monitoring a device, you want that device to be up as frequently as possible. And if there is a problem, you want to send somebody out there that has the skills, the tools, the parts to fix that problem with one truck roll. And so the more insight you can gain into if there is a challenge, what's the root cause and what's the resolution? And here's the prescription that you need to follow. Because we talked about this earlier, but labor's scarce, skilled technicians are scarce. It's not a free resource to have a field technician that knows what they're doing to get out there and resolve it. So anything you can do to increase that hit rate, if there is a challenge, is incredibly important. So AI and ML are playing a very big role in this, because if you think about, albeit tiny data, there's a lot of tiny data. And AI models can be trained on a refrigerator, an elevator, a generator. What does that data mean? Then what's the high probability as to the root cause and the resolution?
Gotcha. Okay. Let's get a bit into use cases here. So I think Digi probably has as much insight because of the breadth of your portfolio and the areas where you're playing into which use cases are really being heavily adopted and also being scaled up, right? There's a lot of use cases that find niche applications that might be very valuable for, a team here and there, but just don't find that scale in the market. And then there are a handful that really have a great ROI in a lot of different cases and scale up. So what are the use cases where you see that for many organizations, it's quite easy to make the business case?
Yeah, if you think about the IoT world, and let's just look at the type of a number of assets out there, there's a bit of a pyramid, right? Things that are very expensive themselves, and the cost of downtime is very painful and costs a lot. That's at the top of the pyramid. Things that cost a very little, and the cost of downtime is relatively lower at the bottom of the period. So as IoT solutions are becoming more cost effective, you're able to address more of that pyramid. We're not necessarily down to the very bottom yet, but we're going down that pyramid to address more and more business cases because the cost of solutions are coming down. And some really valuable use cases early on, monitoring, heavy equipment, right? So to monitor a load in a truck, that load itself could be worth, several $1 million, especially let's say you're carrying semiconductors or maybe fine arts or, jewelry. And so monitoring that load is worthwhile. You'll spend a decent amount of money to make sure that load is protected. And if you think about very heavy machines, they'll think about excavators, cranes, monitoring those things, cement trucks, very valuable because it costs a lot. And if I don't deliver that cement on time, or if that slump mix isn't of the right, quality and grade, I could ruin a construction site. And now we're getting to more domestic applications. We're monitoring, let's say, the pool system on your home pool, or monitoring things that maybe aren't at that high value are now becoming more economical. And the first and foremost thing is you're having a better customer experience, right? You have better uptime. It'll lead to more and more sales. But you're also saving a tremendous amount, making sure you don't have field calls and having to replace parts or other things that would hit more direct costs. So the industrial applications that we see the most value right now, we do a ton of work in both traditional and renewable energy. And so if you think about EV chargers, there's an article in Wall Street Journal recently that a reporter visited 120 EV chargers in the LA area, and only like 70 work, and so monitoring these chargers and making sure they're up. And if they're not up, you get somebody out there that can fix it is really important. We talked about medical devices. That's an increasingly valuable and popular area for IoT. Another good example is in agriculture. There's a lot of agriculture right now that's adopting IoT, whether that's in irrigation. Of course, machinery has always been the leader, but now there's increasingly a very cost-effective soil sensors and other things that can provide really good data. We also do a lot of work in smart city, whether that be traffic lights, digital signs, outdoor lighting, mass transit. That's very strong, and mass transit is really starting to bounce back from the COVID era. Lastly, I'd say retail. Retail is very important. Having a point of sale system that works all the time is very important. I don't know if you've ever been in a retail environment where that POS system is down and you're having to collect, payments on a more manual basis, whether that's cash or running a credit card through a more traditional thing. That's increasingly important as well as retail uptime. And there's a number of other cases as well, but those are just highlight a few.
And so you mentioned, a number of those are very strictly uptime cases, or, let's say some kind of maintenance, right? Is the system operating? And if it's having an issue, what's the issue? Some of those could be more operational, right? So where is the system? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? So if you're doing logistics or something, it's not so much, is the truck broken down, but it's where is the truck? Has the temperature, gone up above or below a certain threshold? So it's more of an operations. I know you also do remote management now. So can we remotely manage an asset? We were looking at mining recently, and it's just a very dangerous environment, right? So if you can remotely manage these assets, you can do things that you couldn't do otherwise because you'd be putting human lives at risk. So those seem to be maybe some of the big use cases. Other use cases among those scenarios or those markets that you mentioned where you see really high value?
Yeah, Eric, it's a good point you're bringing up, because I think IoT is maturing from monitoring to monitoring and control, and then monitoring, control, respond, right? And water is a big application. Water is a tremendous application, whether it be pumps, whether it be managing water levels, whether it be managing waste facilities. That's becoming a very strong area for monitoring and control. And you used to have to send somebody out to a pump to change a setting or adjust a pump. Now you can do that remotely. Another big example of that is storage tanks that either are housing industrial gases, propane, in some cases agricultural, monitoring the levels of those, and then understanding when levels hit a certain area, I need to replenish that, whether that be oxygen at a hospital or another industrial gas and manufacturing facility. So those are a couple additional examples where both monitoring and control can play a big role.
So I was hosting a managed service provider. So they basically do more traditional telco services, but now are also branching out more into IoT. And one of the things that they mentioned as something that might be interesting is the adoption of generative AI to look at data streams and say, okay, you're collecting this data, you're using it for one or two use cases today. Here's a list of 12 different use cases that you could be, if you combined, the data from your soil sensor with the data from the satellite with the data from, some other, equipment or whatever, then you can determine how many people might want to buy a Coke in this village. And maybe Coca-Cola cares about that because now they're going to ship more Coke to that, that particular town. How do you look at kind of this topic of looking for ways to create more value out of data, and maybe specifically the role of generative AI? Do you see that as being something that will be an important addition to your tech stack in the coming years? Or do you think it's still a bit speculative on what the value could actually be there?
Yeah, there's two thoughts that your statements kind of stimulated in me. One is, as companies deploy more and more IoT systems, there may be a really exciting opportunity for people that actually go above that layer and can combine information that are maybe from different IoT providers or systems that unlock tremendous value. Maybe, for example, a refrigerator is being monitored here and a building control unit is being monitored. And the fact that, this building control unit is sort of competing against this refrigerator, how do we get those in better harmony, right? So that you're not warming the building too much so that it actually causes the refrigerator some additional energy usage. The other thing that your comment stimulated was really in the role of AI. And, we know AI right now, and it's going to evolve tremendously, but we know AI more in a kind of a server type environment where we're having tremendous amounts of data and we're using AI to crawl the internet or crawl maybe your local database and do it much quicker than a human could and come back with hopefully information that, has been curated. And I think you're going to see AI evolve a lot. And I think there's a role for, if you will, tiny AI that sits on devices. And that's really curated for information that's coming from a machine. And it knows to ignore certain data and highlight other pieces. And it's teeny. It's not relying on massive amounts of internet data because it's too expensive and would require too much compute power at the edge. So I think there's a role for that, if you will, tiny AI sitting at the edge and maybe in concert with its, bigger and older sibling that sits in the cloud where it has more access to power and data and resources that can make, use of a broader data set to drive even more insight. So I think AI is, as a lot of us probably agree, is in its early stages. And I think we're going to be exploding in terms of it fracturing into different environments.
Digi's portfolio that you're working on today or planning to launch in the near future that is embedding AI in your solutions?
Yeah. So Eric, I think earlier I noticed on your podcast, you had a chance to interview some of my colleagues in SmartSense. Sammy Colt, I think it was in August of last year. And SmartSense is a Digi division that focuses on monitoring food and medicine throughout the supply chain to make sure that's been handled properly. And so when you get your penicillin or you eat your apple, it's been, cared for. And we're doing a lot of work in SmartSense on understanding the language of the different equipment that keeps things hot or cold. And depending upon its language or its change of language, will actually tell the user, here's specifically what's going on that's wrong, and here's the corrective action that you need to do. And in many cases, back to your earlier comment, we're integrating that data now into other systems that do work order management. Well, we'll open a trouble ticket in an asset management system, and only us have the authority to close that ticket when that asset has been restored to its healthy state. So I think there's some exciting things, both AI and then combining that with some workflow.
Yeah. Oh, great. This is going to be a very interesting development in the coming years to see how this actually reflects in the world. The earlier comment that you made around this higher level system perspective. So looking at, I think Digi has, at least according to your website, something like 23 plus billion devices in the world. And so right now, most of those devices are deployed in, or maybe almost all of them are deployed in more intranets, right? So it's one company with their devices. They firewall it for good reason. And so we don't have an internet of things, right? We don't have this 23 billion devices that are all talking to each other. And that there's a lot of practical challenges there. But I'm curious, what do you think is Digi's role in trying to start to combine at least some of those intranets so that you can start to say, okay, there's 6 different companies that are all deploying technology in this building. Let's at least get those 6 companies to start talking to each other. So you gave that example earlier, but what is Digi's role within that transformation?
I think Digi, some won't be exclusive, but I think Digi can play a really powerful role. Let me give you a real life example. We have a customer that uses our SmartSense solution for making sure that their food is properly maintained, that their heating equipment is operating properly inside of a restaurant location. And we're doing some creative things with looking at point of sale data and having that impact both inventory, but also workflow. So if you sell more or less of food in a certain restaurant, that will have an impact on how frequently you take out the trash, you clean the restrooms, whatever that may be. And so I think it's a very small example, but an example of taking data from multiple sources and driving that unique insight that can have tremendous efficiencies. In my prior role at PeopleNet, before we had a chance to sell to Trimble, we actually took data from drivers' fuel cards where they're purchasing fuel. We had the dispatch data from where they got deployed to pick up and drop off. And then we had the telematics in the device. that said, here's what's actually happening inside the vehicle. By combining those three sets of data that we weren't the sole provider of, we were able to tell you things such as, was somebody stealing fuel? Because we see 100 gallons purchased, but only 80 gallons got burned. We could tell a non-performing vehicle. We had enough data where we could say, hey, this vehicle, given the weight of the load and the terrain that it's traveling, should get 6 miles per gallon. I know that seems horribly low, but that's how trucking works. It should be getting 7 miles per gallon. So either we have a maintenance issue or driver behavior, and then we can get into the telematics area and say, hey, was the driver using the vehicle in a predictable manner, driving within a certain speed? And we ended up having 95% hit rate on maintenance items. We weren't able to always tell you that it was, say, an air filter versus an oil filter versus, say, an engine, but we knew that it needed maintenance. And I think those are some of the exciting things that Digi can play a role in.
So, I mean, those are great examples. They still feel like examples where the data could still be owned by one company, but there could be a case in the maintenance issue, right, where the manufacturer of the engine would say, well, I will pay you, 1 cent per, whatever volume of data to actually purchase that data, because that's going to help me to design my next generation of engines. Or an insurance company might say, okay, I want to, I'll lower your insurance, right? I mean, I guess that's something that's already being done if you share data with me about the driver behavior. But this monetization of data, where external organizations would find value in that data and are willing to either reduce their price. What do you see as the adoption of this? Because I always feel like with IoT solutions, you have this kind of value stack where in most situations, you're probably only getting 20, 40, 60% of the value of the data. There's all this missing value because you just organizationally can't transfer that data to the other people that would find value there. So there's lawyers involved, so it's not necessarily simple. But what do you see as the potential to extract more value by exchanging data across organizations?
Eric, I think it's tremendous value. And I think those impediments that you brought up are real. IoT systems inherently tend to be proprietary. So the data is maybe owned by the customer, but accessing the data, is not routine. There's no IoT standard in which, Eric, you and I agree to both, store and exchange data, right? So it's not like we can go to some NIST or some standards body that says, hey, well, if I need the data, here's the method in which I access it. So it takes a lot of, brute force effort. And the best business cases are the ones that are getting serviced, right? And some of those I highlighted. So it's going to take a while, I think, for that to happen, but you can see it over time. That's going to be the direction where the data is going to be more accessible. It's going to be able to be integrated more efficiently and effectively. And some of those economic and maybe legal issues, it certainly isn't a technical one, but some of those economic and legal issues will get resolved because the value will be so great.
Earlier in the conversation, we touched on some of the technologies that are starting to scale up in terms of adoption. You've already discussed AI a bit. You touched briefly on 5G. I'm curious, where do you see 5G finding its role in the IoT stack today?
Yeah, 5G, I've been in wireless ever since analog. So I know wireless maybe too much, and that's a help and a hindrance at times. But 5G, I'd say, has probably under-delivered a little bit on its hype. 5G, 4G was such a step up from 3G in terms of speed. And 4G didn't stand, and with the 4G advanced, and 4G kept progressing. So 5G is probably underwhelmed a little bit on the speed side. And then inversely, one of the promises of 5G was that it was going to be low latency. And so it was going to really deliver for maybe applications where data bandwidth wasn't really the need, but it was really having that latency reduced. Now, with all that said and done, 5G is still wonderful, and it's taken a little bit longer to be adopted, whether it's the cost of equipment or the proliferation of the standard throughout the network. It will still be a tremendous thing. I think 5G right now, in its earliest cases, are more on the speed side, where we're replacing more and more lines, physical lines, with wireless. And right now, fixed wireless access is probably the most prominent example, much more so than the sub-gig, mobile environment. So that, I think, is the earlier. I think we're coming into age on the low latency. That tends to be a more fractured market, harder to have a big bang effect. There's a lot of hard work that goes into taking advantage of a low latency network that are well beyond just the network itself. And of course, Eric, what's been another hype curve that maybe is on the downswing is private networks. Private networks came out super hype on, boy, wouldn't you like to have your own, cellular-based network? in your manufacturing facility, in your distribution warehouse. And I think there was a lot of excitement on it. And then people were like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of work, not just to install, but to quite frankly to maintain. So I think the use cases have shrunk a little bit on private networks. But 5G, I think, will still unlock more and more opportunity in the high end, particularly early on. I think it'll take a little longer for the low latency side of things. Probably the poster child for low latency was autonomous driving. And, you've seen the article, we spent $100 billion on autonomous driving and we still don't have it. Those low latency business cases or use cases are really hard to solve,
Yeah. Well, if we get there, that will be the business case for 5G right there, won't it?
Yeah.
Pay back for all that infrastructure. Are there other technologies? I mean, we already touched a bit on AI, but other technologies that you see being quite impactful either already today or maybe if you look forward 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. So I'm bullish on LoRa, Eric. I like LoRa in particular for a local wireless standard. I'm not as big a fan of LoRa as a public network. There are a lot of challenges on the economic side of a LoRa network operator being able to sustain itself. And I've been around long enough that I've seen, Artis, RAM, all these other alternative terrestrial systems really face challenges against cellular, who's just the most dominant. And cellular has been, evolving. But I think LoRa as a local standard, complementing Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, I'm very bullish on LoRa. I think cellular will be the dominant. Satellite, with the introduction of Starlink, I think has been really interesting. Anything Musk gets involved with tends to have a little bit of excitement and good engineering behind it. And so unfortunately, we're seeing Starlink, being deployed in Ukraine, Russia, with all of its capabilities. But I think there's some interesting use cases as either a complement to terrestrial or in some places, challenging other satellite providers.
Yeah, that satellite is an interesting case. I mean, certainly Starlink is putting a lot of, but they're just now one among several players that are really investing heavily in that. And I guess that opens up a lot of territory that is not addressable by cellular. Today, do you already see strong demand or is this really more future?
We're monitoring. Yeah. LoRa, we're involved with full force, but Starlink, we're more in monitor mode. We're looking at, what competitors are doing, what customers are asking for. I think today, and to be fair, most of our businesses in North America and Europe, where cellular networks are pretty pervasive. And so we're not doing as much in maritime or maybe developing countries where Starlink has potentially a much bigger impact.
Great. Well, Ron, I think we covered a good bit of territory. Anything that we haven't touched on here that's important for folks to understand?
Listen, I think the big message that, that Digi's been really, staking its ground on is this idea of us providing more and more of the solution. I think sometimes customers get so involved in the engineering of an IoT solution, they forget that's a very important work. But the most important work is leveraging the insights, actions, and decisions you can make based on that data. So routinely, Eric, I talk to customers about, leave the plumbing to the experts like Digi. You focus on much higher value activity, like taking advantage of this data. And what's it going to do to keep your asset up and running? What's it going to do for the next engineering cycle? How do you become closer to your customer? How do you make better use of your field force, whether it's internal or external? So I think that, how it is, messages you have to say many times for it to, and sometimes you get a little bit ahead of yourself. But that's probably the biggest thing that we're striving to do at Digi is to provide more of that solution for our customers so they can focus on higher value things. And I tell customers all the time, I think you can do it, but do you feel like you want and need to do it? Because there's much more value in spending time on what the data means. I routinely, Eric, talk to my people, they will provide all sorts of data analysis on what's happened and then stop. And I'm like, okay, what's going to happen? People that can predict and alter the future are much more valuable than people that can record the past. Not that we can't learn from the past, but I think that's what we're trying to go on this journey with our customers. Let us calculate, collect, present the data on what's happening. You spend your time thinking about the future.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that means then or it sounds like it means that Digi is not planning to go into really specific vertical applications, but leaving that to customers and partners and focusing on enabling those applications. Or are there specific areas where you think it would make sense for Digi to provide? Well,
certainly, Eric, SmartSense, we've gone deep in SmartSense. So we've gotten into this condition monitoring. We felt like there was an opportunity, a relatively green market. We didn't see any, dominant provider. And so that's one area, Eric, where we win as a turnkey provider and offering the entire IoT solution. 75% of our business, we are enabling other IoT solutions. So I wouldn't preclude us from going deep in another area, but I think as you can tell, I think vertical domain is very important. So if you want to do pipeline monitoring, you want to do storage tank monitoring, you want to do the monitoring of water in municipalities, I think it's really important to have that domain, because it's not good enough just to bring the IoT solution. You've got to know exactly the problems they're facing and what solutions you're going to bring.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, Ron, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate the conversation today.
Yeah, Eric, appreciate your time. Great questions and great to spend this time with you.